Memory Palace is a work for solo percussion and electronics. It was written in 2012. It was commissioned by a consortium of percussionists throughout the country and commissioned by the J Fund, the Jerome Foundation. It was sort of, by the nature of the project, I was asked by the lead percussionist, Owen Weaver, to write a piece that, knowing that a lot of them didn't have access to a lot of instruments, he said, you can write whatever you want, but I would prefer if I can tour it, and therefore, I don't know if we're going to have a marimba, we're not going to have a vibraphone, I don't know what we're going to have, but I'll make whatever you want. And so this began this journey of finding different ways to have, a lot of pieces have odd percussion instruments, but I'm like, can I have instruments that are pitched and a piece that has a 20-minute narrative that is also a piece that is for these odds and ends. So the piece wound up being scored for an old acoustic guitar, laid on its back and retuned, just open strings. It's scored for 14 slats of tuned wood, slats of wood that we made from Home Depot, 14 metal pipes, and 7 beer bottles, along with a few actual percussion instruments. And sort of as I was writing this piece, a lot of the sounds in it, particularly the guitar and the beer bottles being blown at different pitches, sort of came to really evoke in me the sort of specific periods of my life and in my youth, and and then sort of as I thought about the other more percussive movements, these images kept coming to me that really related to my childhood, growing up in the suburbs on Long Island, and I thought there's something kind of like powerful about connecting the thing about classical music is it's often held up as this lofty thing, and I'm like, well, if we're going to have all these quotidian objects, I want all my quotidian memories in it as well, of the suburbs, of highways, of camping, and that's what the piece became. So it's just under, I think it's about 20 minutes long, and in 5 movements, and I've been really thrilled that it's been one of my most performed pieces, because sort of every percussionist who does it, the sound is a little bit different because they have to make all the instruments themselves, and the sort of setup is always changing and evolving. And then in, I think, 2015, LAPQ, Los Angeles Percussion Quartet, had asked me for a new piece, and I sort of thought, well, I have a piece for percussion quartet, I have a piece for solo percussion. I didn't, at that moment, really I didn't think it made sense to write a new piece, but they loved Memory Palace so much and asked me, can we play this piece? And I thought, well, that's really cool, because the original version really is for percussion and a lot of drones, electronic drones. And so what I wound up doing is taking those resonant electronic drones and orchestrating them for marimbas and vibraphones and temple bowls. And so what winds up happening is most of the electronics in the piece are then transformed into live percussion parts, and it went from being sort of a monologue between soloists and electronics to a dialogue of chamber musicians. I think, well, okay, so we got like I wrote the second movement at that time, was how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then 7 was the second movement, and sort of I sent it to the percussionist. I'm like, okay, there's 7 slats in this piece, and then I was writing the 4th movement. I was like, actually, we need no. So it might actually be something like 17, but sort of the second movement is all low wood, and those are all kind of this like gradual build of an octave. And sort of as I got to the 7th movement, because the piece is in an arch form, I started thinking about much higher pitched wood, and so that whole movement spans the full octave of the wood. And also the piece uses what's called a split mallet roll or a marimba roll, and I remember I was meeting with Ian Rosenbaum, who's one of the percussionists who was on the commission, who's played the piece many, many times. And he was like, oh, you could do these like marimba rolls, where, and then you sort of can play 2 different tremolos at the same time. And I think it's kind of this old-fashioned technique that gets used for a few minutes in pieces. And then I'm like, cool, you're gonna do this for like 8 minutes in this piece. So it's a very athletic work. I Will Learn to Love a Person was originally written in 2013. It was commissioned by a group called the Colorfield Ensemble, with support from Chamber Music America. It was a really exciting project for me. It was the first sort of fancy commission I'd ever gotten, and I was very excited to, for that. And, I had written my opera Invisible Cities, and, Italo Calvino's novel is the basis, and he writes in such kind of like beautiful, lush, complicated prose. And sort of, when I started getting this piece, I was like, I just want to do the complete opposite of that now. I want to challenge myself. And so I'd come across the poetry of the writer Violin, who was a young poet living in New York about my age. And I was really inspired by the sort of directness of his poetry, you know, as opposed to Calvino, where it's these amazing concepts. Violin's was, you know, why did you do that to me? You know, I will learn to love a person. And it had all these like incredibly simple sentiments in them, which to me struck me in the complete opposite way of being really ripe for adaptation as songs. I mean, almost they were cusp song lyrics. And, you know, I always think about how when you set music, you almost want it to be not lacking, but having room for music. And, you know, if you read, sometimes you read, you know, song lyrics aloud, they sound really stupid. And they sound so amazingly deep in a song. And I think that, I don't think Violin's poetry sounded that way, but I felt the similar simplicity that allowed for, room for music. So the songs, the piece is in 5 movements and sort of set in a palindromic form, which seems to be very popular for me, that I've done quite a few times now. And it mixes, the songs are alternately very sort of deadpan and serious and very humorous. And, you know, there's like, there's a great line in the second song, which is, my favorite emotions include brief calmness and good weather, and I am the only person alive. And I actually said it in a very kind of like funny way. And I mean, it's because it's so, there's a sort of melodrama in all the text. And the piece is scored for kind of what I call like a hyper piano. It's piano, vibraphone, glockenspiel, and clarinet or sax. And they are kind of almost playing in unison the entire time, which creates a very lush sort of resonant texture, although quite challenging to perform because especially the percussionists and piano are just in unison so often and every attack is hit together. So it's a very, very chamber-like piece. But so the kind of odd movements are these sort of slow, you know, I think they were described as text message recitative lyrics, whereas the inner movements are sort of fast and metoric and bright and colorful. And it's a piece that's really, I think, spoke to a lot of singers who've done the piece. I think that it allows singers to express a very wide and broad emotional vocabulary and very direct emotions at the same time. And then in 2013, I made a version of it just for voice and piano, and I've come to understand it as actually quite a different piece because the chamber ensemble version requires so much coordination of players. Is that I would not say the singer is all in charge. I think it's really chamber music in the classic sense. The soprano and piano version, I think, has a lot more freedom for the singer. So I think that one becomes more of a classic song cycle. It's more of a piece about sort of the singer being able to express her emotions rather than sort of a chamber-like feel. So that's what I found is that's been a really great version to have, first of all, for singers just to sort of perform it on, you know, singers don't always have access to a chamber group, especially of high quality, but they often have access to one pianist. So you know, it sort of has spread the work further out. And also I think actually I found that different singers work better for each version. I find that lighter sopranos, higher sopranos actually work better for the piano version, whereas sort of a fuller voice is needed for the chamber version. Violin Sonata. So I really love this piece, and it's sort of an outlier in my catalog. First of all, that it's called Violin Sonata, which is so, you know, most of my pieces have evocative titles taken from poetry, and I sort of love the idea of just calling it Violin Sonata, because it really was. I mean, not that it's really not, but it has a lot of the superficial trappings of a sonata. It has fast, slow, fast movements. It's virtuosic, and I just sort of love the idea of almost like it refers to a sonata in a kind of both literal and metaphorical way. But it was commissioned by a violinist named Rachel Lee Priday and David Kaplan, pianist. And it was written sort of to appeal to, you know, it was my way of accessing virtuosity, I think, more than anything else. You know, Rachel is, you know, kind of an incredible virtuosic violinist, but I had no interest in writing her sort of, I don't think I have interest in traditional virtuosity. So I was like, well, how can I write this piece for her that she looks great and sounds cool, but also, you know, achieves a lot of my musical ends? And I found that each movement became a kind of etude for one player. The first movement is a perpetual motion where she plays lots of up and down arpeggios, just like, you know, So it's all natural harmonics, and she's playing very, very fast, and little by little, the pianist joins her just sort of one note at a time until they become, again, a sort of hyper instrument where they're just, it's loud and resonant like the piano, but it's sort of so scratchy and exciting like the violin, and it sort of inexorably leads into what I always feel is such a inevitable moment, and everyone always says it's surprising, so I don't know if I did a bad job of composing it or if it just works one way or the other, but it breaks out into one of these chords that I think sound like a Bruce Springsteen song almost. You've got these it's an uncharacteristically joyous piece for me, and the second movement was more to me a piano solo, in that the pianist play. I was thinking about David. He loves playing Brahms, and I said I had these 3-against-5 perpetual sort of flowing Brahmsian sound, with the violinist playing just sort of every possible. I mean, I very much wrote it kind of with the violin in hand, and sort of finding these bell-like harmonics, or these kind of upbeat. I mean, I don't know how to play violin, but imagining how all these little fragments could connect into the sound of a piano solo. And then the last movement is sort of this second perpetual motion movement where it finds its way very gradually back to those original chords. But it's been described as it's my only really sort of joyous piece, and that's why I like it a lot. The Pieces That Fall to Earth is a work for soprano and 14 players. It was commissioned by the LA Phil, and it was written for Hilla Plitman and the LA Phil New Music Group. And she's sort of this incredibly dexterous soprano, and she sort of has this huge high register. And I sort of thought about how I write for the voice. It tends to be either kind of syllabic or melodic. And in that piece, I really challenged myself to write more in a more varied way. And so that piece really, much more than my other music, has a lot of leaps in it and a lot of coloratura writing. It actually doesn't go that high. It's funny. It's it goes only up to to a D, but it feels sort of stratospheric the way it happens in the piece. And that piece very much to me feels like it starts where I Will Learn to Love a Person That's Off. It takes some of the syllabic and kind of melodic writing in that piece and tries to add different elements, whether it's vocalese, which I don't do enough, whether it's there's whispering, and basically asks a singer to do everything a singer can do. And it's set to the poetry of Kay Ryan, who's one of my favorite poets. She was the poet laureate a few years back, and her poetry appealed to me because it does a few things that many poets don't do. One, her poems are extremely short, so it really allowed a lot of room for music, as I said before. And they also rhyme a lot of the time, which is very rare in contemporary poetry. And when it's done, it's usually done in a really uninteresting way. And her rhymes are clever and not very obvious, and sort of, just like we have rhymes in music, we have rhymes in words. And it was really fun to sort of have that kind of oddly traditional element in my text setting. And so the piece was premiered by the LA Phil and will come out, I'm very excited to say, in a new recording done by Wild Up this coming summer on New Amsterdam Records. I wrote Double Happiness for the Living Earth show, a duo from San Francisco of percussion and electric guitar. And it was composed for them, I think, in 2012, based on a bunch of field recordings I took in Italy while I was spending a summer there as a resident at a residency called Civitella Ranieri. And I spent the summer sort of recording different sounds of the Italian countryside, really sort of this huge rainstorm that changed the seasons was a big sound that happened throughout the piece, and there was this kind of remarkable bell at the train station there. There was this very persistent, loud, high bell. And so these sounds, when combined together with actually recordings of my grandfather's violin and my grandfather's accordion that I played, sort of formed a kind of travelogue, a musical narrative from home into where my whole family comes from and back home again. And out of this forms this piece, which is a sort of delicate 5-movement form again piece, which the opening movement is very, very delicate. It's scored for all harmonics on the guitar and percussion just playing very, very delicately on the violin against the sort of some other very fast, rhythmic, exciting movement that happens later in the piece. And the Living Earth Show has played the piece many, many times. They've choreographed it, they've recorded it, and sort of came to the point where a few years later, they were playing it a lot and very few other groups were, because there's very few guitar percussion duos. And so my friends from Latitude 49, a group in Chicago, asked me if I would consider making a version for piano and percussion, which I actually thought was a great idea, because if you look inside a piano, you've basically got a bunch of plucked strings. And so I set about rewriting the piece using a lot of sounds inside the piano. There's harmonics, there's muted notes, and there's notes plucked with a guitar pick, just the way a guitar is, of course. And so the result is a piece that has been performed quite a bit more, thankfully, because there's far more piano duos and percussion duos, and I've really become very fond of both versions in different ways. They're both really, they've become their own pieces, and they sound very different to me, and while the general kind of feel is the same, each one I think has its charms.